Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Daily Friends Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Chris Hutton. Chris, how are you doing?
Good afternoon, guys. Good to be back in the land of the rolling blackouts. But looking forward to chatting to you guys today.
Indeed, Chris has been swanning around the US, no doubt taking his secret training lessons from our CIA benefactors. I mean, I didn't say anything. Please ignore what I just said. And of course, we also have Mr. Hermann Pretorius, who is once again on today. Hermann, how are you doing? Thank you for coming back again.
Yeah, no, my CIA training was of such a nature that I could spot you making a mistake there. I mean, I just have an eye for those sort of small details, like when someone reveals their CIA training. It's really it's a deep level of understanding of the human psyche, but also just spending time with Chris. I mean, you get so affronted by human error that you just get really good at spotting it. Like, look, I mean, just look at that beard.
All right, so I see we're going in. It's a slow news day, which is presumably the reason that there's so much sass going on here right now. But anyway, let's just start off with a story. We're not really going to talk about it, but it's just one of those headlines that makes you slap your head against your forehead. It's as your hand against your forehead. It's a bit like that the tale from the July Riots when a guy who had a proper job and was quite wealthy was caught looting a Woolworths. That was, anyway, we'll get on to that in a minute. But a government official who is earning more than R1 million annually is apparently also receiving a 350 Rand SASA grant of COVID relief. And SASA has apparently not done anything about this yet, despite the fact that it has been reported to them and is in the media. So that's that's great. Anyway. All right, so we're moving on to our first story today, and this is a bit of a retrospective. We're looking at what I think was quite an important event in our in recent history, and that is the July Riots of last year, or as they are called, because I wanted to see if there's a Wikipedia page about them. They are called the Zuma Riots, apparently, on Wikipedia, or the South African 2021 unrest. I think July Riots is a much better term, which saw lots of people killed, lots of people arrested, huge amounts of property damage, numbering in the billions and billions of rands across the country, particularly in KZN, where entire communities sort of essentially had their local retail districts burned down, shopping centers were burned down, people's houses were vandalized, and law and order effectively broke down in parts of the country for about a week, maybe 2 weeks, depending on where you lived. It was a very dark period. And so we're now about a year on from that. I think it started somewhere around the 7th or 8th of July. And we are now, of course, the 12th of July, 1 year later. So, Herman, I'm going to start with you. What do you make of how the July riots impacted us? When they happened, I thought that they would be a bit of a catalyst for some kind of political change going ahead. Do you think that is indeed what happened, or what's your take?
I think it certainly was a catalyst, but it not for political change, more for just a bit of a political nihilism. I do definitely think that in the last year, things in South Africa, the general attitude of South Africans has become worse. There might once have been a bit of an optimism for a post-COVID South Africa, but I think the July riots really showed a dark side that's been bubbling underneath the surface for many years. And people often hate on us on this podcast for broadcasting quote unquote from the white suburbs. It would be interesting to know exactly which suburbs those are. But it just, to be completely honest, the sort of anarchy and the sort of violence and the sort of unpredictability, the lawlessness, the danger and risk is something that most South Africans faced on a daily basis. They are exposed to arbitrary acts of mob violence. They are exposed to opportunistic, violent criminals with very few consequences attached to criminal deeds. So I do think what made it unique was it was this bubbling up to the surface of a latent anger that's been fostering for a very long time. I do think it was also the start of the end of Ramaphosa's honeymoon. that lasted far, far, far too long. I mean, we remember I remember quite vividly, and I'm sure everyone can, the immediate aftermath, and even for a few months after those events occurred, that the media were absolutely willing to buy the line of 12 insurrectionists, these 12 masterminds, of one of them being Karel Niehaus. And it's always wonderful. If Karel Niehaus is one of your masterminds, I think you might be playing in the vegetable league. So once that sort of story became so absurd, and once it became clear that the government was really just making stuff up as they went along, the incompetence of the security cluster with no consequences to any of the ministers involved, that sort of, I think, paved the way for the Arthur Fraser allegations of Ramaphosa's farm and the stashing of the mattress dosh. Really made it.
If I may just briefly interrupt you there. We had the election in November last year.
Yeah.
Does the ANC drop below 50% of the local government elections without the July riots?
Yes, I think so. I think it might have been tighter. I think they might have been just below 49, but I think that the trajectory was quite cruel from the start. But I do think so. Why, to sum up this rambling thing, what have been the consequences? Number one, a cynicism, a deeper cynicism of politics and government than I think we've ever seen before in South Africa. The start of the end of Ramaphosa's honeymoon with the public, probably now, and definitely the media, and also the notion that what I remember quite clearly is in the lead up to those November elections, the DA dared, I say, to promote citizens who protected property and lives and businesses, dared to congratulate them, dared to protect them against allegations of racism. Was that politically wise? I don't know. But what I do remember is that the media gave John Steenhuisen more grief about putting up a poster and then the poster being taken down than they ever gave Ramaphosa about the riots in and of themselves. It really illustrated just again the double standards and the incompetence of many journalists who would rather ask gotcha questions of an opposition leader than ask serious questions of the man responsible for the country.
Yeah, it's kind of amusing that we've had a scandal, or sort of scandal, involving Becky Cele recently, because in any sort of vaguely functioning political system, Becky Cele would not be a minister after what had happened in July last year. And yet we're still talking about him. He's still a minister. He's yet again, embarrassing the government, himself, and the country. And yet so there really were no real consequences. So let me get sort of vaguely philosophical here for a minute, if I may, Chris. One of the things that I think happened in the July riots, so I think there were definitely some attempts to instigate things, but obviously there wasn't the sort of wide network of, kind of dedicated revolutionary cadres to pull off a coordinated action. It was more like a bunch of small stones starting an avalanche. And I think what that kind of speaks to is what we really saw in South Africa. You could simplify South Africa into having two sort of broad mindsets. There's a lot of hardworking, tough people who are trying to get by in a difficult situation. And then there's kind of a large chunk of South Africans who are sort of almost nihilistic. They've kind of just given up on ever really being able to, see much further than the next tender, the next meal, and they're from poor to rich. People who just have sort of been so infected with hopelessness, cynicism, and that kind of thing that they just kind of have given up, I think, on the country. And I think those are the people who took part in the looting. It was this sort of, everything's gone to hell, so I might as well get a TV while I can, because, when else am I going to be able to get one? Firstly, what do you make of that construct that I've just put up? And also, what are your thoughts on the effects of the riots a year later?
Yeah, I think your analysis is more realistic than most. Many try and look what happened through other prisons, but yours takes account of people's reality on the ground and simply what they have to deal with day to day. I mean, not to justify what happened last year in any way, but when you have years and years of promises and years of reform, but you've got 1.5% growth, you've got over 40% unemployment, you've got little prospects for providing for your family and those closest to you, then there are incentives for those frustrations to be exploited and just for it to be nudged in certain ways. I think you're absolutely right to discount the idea of a sort of coordinated effort. I mean, I was going to say if it was an attempted coup, they would have targeted railways and other strategic points, but those have already been targeted. So you don't have to. Maybe it's a longer term coup than an overnight.
Well, our colleague Gabriel always points out that there are, for example, pipelines that run between Hattingh and KZN, which are very easy to target, and those were left alone.
Yeah, I mean, overall, it did serve to expose just how inept the government as a whole has become in terms of police and security and intelligence. I mean, this is something that the RR and the CRA has been warning about for years. I mean, all of the analysts at the Institute, except for Hermann, of course, they've been pointing out with good references and commentary about what could be coming in future months and years, unfortunately. But also just, I should say, it was useful for the ANC and for Ramaphosa to again have this story crafted of, oh, look, there's an RET faction and they're trying to undermine me and my attempts. And it helps the media as well to say, look, Cyril is trying, but he's being undermined by others in his party. That's why we need to support him. And don't worry, he'll get it right and that sort of thing. So it's interesting, the different dynamics that played out. And don't discount that this sort of thing will happen again. We pointed out in this week's risk alert for the CRA, when a country experiences this sort of political strife and instability, there's a much higher probability within the next 12 months after that, 12 to 24 months, that they will again. Now with rising inflation and food prices, I mean, can you really expect this not to happen again? The dollar now we're now at 17 rand to the dollar. All of it's going to become more difficult. So don't be unprepared for when this sort of thing comes about again, regardless of who the instigators might be.
Something I would just want to quickly add to this is we look at a level of state failure, but it's sort of sad that a political organization that was once actually quite politically cunning and understood how to play the game actually prosecuted the People's War relatively successfully. Within the space of a few months, we had the insurrection that never was, and we had parliament that burnt down. Any competent, corrupt government would have been able to fabricate the necessary case to shore up its position. I mean, if you look at the 90s, very much this is how Putin got his leg up to the leadership of Russia. Is there were these domestic incidents of violence that he successfully either instigated or spun in favor of, a law and order style crackdown, and any vaguely competent, megalomaniac politician should have been able to use these events to their advantage. We've seen it happen many, many times before, and the fact that this president couldn't even usefully politically cash in on the sympathy and the open, the open goal of claiming there was a legit insurrection, that they couldn't even conjure up 12 framed, compromised individuals who might have led this insurrection. The fact that they couldn't even frame some, a politically potent person with a burning down of parliament just shows how far the ANC has fallen, not just as a government body, but as a basic player of dirty politics. And I think it's Marius Rudd, our colleague, who keeps on saying that the ANC is now cosplaying as a government. There's nothing real about their governance anymore. They can't actually make government decisions, and they can't even, do the competence of the People's War. Even that low bar has, completely collapsed. The ANC is an absolute husk of itself in its best and worst senses.
So just one final question, and I'll just finish off with you again, Hermann. So I think, what I've noticed is that it seems now that various groups, whether they be sort of taxi organizations or gangs or sort of political, these kind of grassroots political activist groups, I think have been trying to see if they can, maybe even just criminal gangs, they're just trying to see if they can start another riot. So every now and again we have a threat of a national shutdown. that goes viral on social media, or we have someone, someone basically trying to take advantage of the conditions that Chris described of rising cost of living, and the problems being even worse than they were a year ago. Do you think there's any water to my theory there?
I think so, and I also have a theory as to why it's not working. But I think, number one, you are quite right. This is a fertile ground for the opportunists and the small scale, criminals. And I think the organization that we did see in the July riots, I remember the comments being thick with people saying, no, it was organized. You should have seen how organized it was at our end of the, this mall or that mall. I mean, that's small scale stuff. If you're going to steal R1 trillion over a question of 10 years, and you're the ANC, flipping a mall is really, really very, very small fry stuff. So, and besides, the ANC doesn't have that organizational competence to, flip a mall into and loot it. But the reason I think that these sort of opportunistic, small fry, anarchist incidents for personal gain, or perhaps the political upper hand in a regional conflict for this council seat or that union position, the reason I think these things fail is one of the first elements or symptoms of depression is just inactivity, malaise, an inability and to be motivated to do, frankly, anything. And there are books to be written about the psychology of South Africans and this collective depression that we've been experiencing, because it really is something fascinating. You speak to psychologists and you speak about all types of syndromes, a battered woman syndrome, and you think, oh, well, South Africans have all those symptoms and depression. So I do think part of the reason why we are so bland is the will to be proactive in any direction, whether that's economically productive or politically destructive, has been so sapped by the 10 years that South Africans have had to endure that you can't even, riot them into some sort of action. And it's truly depressing, and it's really sad stuff. But I do think if there's a solution in that direction, political parties would do well to understand the psychology of getting someone out of a toxic relationship, getting someone out of this state of inactive depression. There's some deep psychological stuff that one can't really study in a year or two. These will be decades of polling and analysis and so on, and we're trying to do that sometimes. But yeah, I think that's part of the reason why South Africans are so docile. Our kho is just gone.
If you found this podcast interesting, please like the video. If you're watching it on YouTube, please share it around, and please leave us good reviews on the podcast apps. We'd really appreciate that. All right, let's move on to our next story. And this is about a report from the Equal Education Law Center, which was looking into underperforming schools across South Africa. So this report classified a school as underperforming if their matric pass rate was below 65%, and they produced less than 30% of bachelor and diploma passes. So in other words, what I'd call closer to being sort of a real matric pass, because the standard, the technical pass here for matric sets the bar very low. So I think diploma and bachelor passes are much closer to an accurate representation of whether people have been educated. And this found that 80% of schools across the country fall into this category of being dysfunctional, and that most of these schools attend to a majority Black or colored populations, and are also predominantly located in rural areas. They also looked at various things like the completion rates for Black and colored youths, which were 51.6% for Black young people, 52% for coloreds, 81% for Indians, and about 81% for whites. In fact, for Indians, the completion rate of school was very slightly better than for whites. So the report, I think, goes on to talk about what it thinks are some solutions. It says that a lot of schools are failing to meet the national curriculum statement and are falling into its criteria for underperformance. That support from the department is not very good. That sometimes principals aren't doing their job. but there's nothing in here about school unions or teachers unions rather. So Chris, just generally your thoughts on this report and what lessons we should perhaps take from it.
I'd argue it probably doesn't go far enough in terms of the recommendations. I mean, saying that, for example, that these schools are failing because they don't adhere to the national curriculum standards. Maybe there are issues with the national curriculum standards in the first place. Maybe some of those outcomes and the way that they're conceived in terms of ideology and how the state thinks it should implement them. I think that should be a deeper discussion as well, but you probably won't have that anytime soon because the assumption is that the state should provide education in the first place. That's more of a meta worry than anything else. I don't think necessarily throwing more money at these particular inefficiencies will solve the problem. You need buy-in from the students, from parents, from communities. You need that sense of if students see value in it, then they'll take ownership of it. But you need to do that communication and that bridging as well. You need maybe to offer different options in terms of not just the grade 1 to grade 12 track, but other things as well, different diplomas and that sort of thing. And then, I mean, finally, it really points to the dangers of not a monopoly in education, but very strong regulations and legislation against homeschooling, against private schools, the state trying to force those out of existence because it then provides the state, regardless of who's in charge, which particular party, but the current ruling party, that tool to shape how future generations think and what they expect from the state and that connection that they see with the party and the state and with themselves. So it's a lot to try and break up. Maybe we'll just see the breaking up because these schools are failing in the first place. So parents are going to try and find ways to do so. And hopefully you have entrepreneurs and innovative people stepping into that breach, especially for the low-income communities, and trying to find different ways that they can help those students. Hopefully then you'll see a bit more citizen sort of activism and ownership and actual progress going forward. I mean, education is a central part of that. Education is way too important to entrust to the state, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think recent legislative efforts, such as I believe it's the Bella Bill, we're really seeing government seems to be a lot more concerned with the presence of private schools than it is with ensuring excellence in state schools. What do you make of this, Owen?
Oh, no, absolutely right. I do think you're as a government and a political party, you should know you're in trouble when your school system seems to be, performing worse than child slavery in terms of preparing kids for a productive economic participatory role. As I'm not a parent yet, whatever, but I can't see a reason for people for kids really to feel strongly about their education. You're in a country where 3 out of every 4 young people are unemployed, where 4 out of every 10 people, on a conservative estimation, are unemployed. If there's no objective to chase through basic skills development, then why try? If you know you're going to receive social grants, then why put yourself at risk of losing that and going through the trouble of 12 years of schooling and then an attempted employment? Just cut out the middle.
Right, this is when I was talking earlier about that sort of nihilistic feeling that I think drives quite a lot of people in the country. This is where it comes from. This is sort of the origins of that feeling.
Yeah, and sort of our colleague Gabriel has spoken about this before, about how he has traveled across the country, and dorpie after dorpie, you just find this entrenched nihilism, this entrenched poverty of ambition and hope and identity. My grandfather was on social grants, my father was on social grants, I'm on social grants, and the kid I'm fathering now will be on social grants. There's no purpose in any of us developing skills. So why bother with schools? And the Bella Bill is I think completely indicative of where the government is concerned. It's not concerned about actually delivering. It's concerned about keeping its coalition together. The trade unions need to be, or the teachers unions need to be held on side. Either it's that, or they genuinely ideologically are committed to a centralized control of education. It is honestly one of the easiest areas of policy to fix. Along with ESCOM, schools are right up there in terms of fixing, because almost anything is better than what we currently have. The world over, there are shovel-ready forms of education policy that you can implement and see results almost immediately. You don't have to go the whole classic liberal hog of introducing school vouchers for everyone, but at least try to understand that the purpose of an education is to equip the next generation to be economically productive. And that has just gone out the window. It's no longer about economic productivity. It is, at best, if we're going to be incredibly charitable, it is keeping school kids off the streets long enough so that they fall into a life of social grants rather than crime. That is the best reading you can give to this government's policy of trying to force kids into schools that are useless and that deliver ultimately economically useless participants.
It's also worth mentioning, I think, at this point that I think it's India, which has managed to get literally hundreds of millions of the poorest people on earth, even poorer than South Africans, into private schools across the country. Now, not perfect system. There are definitely things you can complain about there, but their education system is almost certainly better than ours. And on average, their population is much poorer than ours. So we can
7 years ago,
better.
7 years ago, the previous CEO of the Institute of Race Relations wrote a very useful case study that I urge people to go and read. It's a 2015 study comparing a low-fee independent school in a township to the state schools in the immediate vicinity. Same socioeconomic class, same geographic area, same economic exposure, same economic opportunities, same parental demographics, and yet in the schools, where the independence of the school is key to driving parental engagement and excellence and deliverables of education, the kids outperformed their state-schooled peers by double digits in terms of percentage points and matric pass rates. I think it was, the one was in the 70s, the other was in the 30s. Same kids, same area, same opportunities. You can't make the argument that South Africa's kids are just stupid. I mean, if they are equally stupid across the board. So the idea here that there's no solution out there is firstly nonsense, and then secondly, there's a special circle of hell for people who shut down the small part of our education system that's working. And here's looking at you, Angie Motsekga. The independent schools in South Africa, the private schools, they are working. They are delivering kids. Perhaps you don't like the look of those kids, but most of all, you seem just to be ignorant about what works. If you seek to shut down and further extend your infectious incompetence to even those small areas of hope, then honestly, there aren't swear words strong enough.
All right. Let's very briefly, because we don't have a lot of time, move on to our last topic. And Chris, I'm going to start with you here. The Labour Minister, July Riots, has said that he wants to create as many as 2 million jobs before 2024, the next elections. He says, I don't know whether this is achievable or not, but this is certainly what I'm working towards. However, the solutions he proposed here, I think, are very zero-sum. He basically says that, look, rather than reforming our strict labor laws or our sort of business relations, relationship between unions and workers and unions and business and all that kind of thing, he says, we're just going to make it illegal to hire foreigners, and this is fine because this is what they do in Zimbabwe and Nigeria. What do you make of this, Chris?
Yeah, talk about the fallacy of thinking that the amount of jobs is fixed. I mean, it is the case in a more socialist or communist society, and when you have less economic freedom, it's only about who you know. There's no real economic growth and investment and small business formation. But yeah, if unemployed people have been struggling up until now, they should sit back in even more fear with the Minister of Labour saying that government is focused on solving this problem. That spells even worse for their prospects, I think. It's continuing with the same policies that have led to a record high unemployment rate. So if the consequences are worse, no one should be surprised by that.
Indeed. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so I won't be able to come to you, Herman.
Something very, very quickly. I see C-Dog
15 seconds.
says something about IQ in South Africa. Go read Thomas Sowell on this, on the flexibility of IQs. You will see that within 1 or 2 generations, IQs can improve significantly through issues like nutrition and stuff. Don't buy into that determinist nonsense.
Reading Thomas Sowell is almost always a good idea. But anyway, that is all the time we have for today. So thank you very much for listening. We hope that you enjoyed the show, and we will see you tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.